Over 2 months ago, crossing into North Korea intentionally was a U.S. private named Travis King. He is now back home.
The United States has secured the return of Private Travis King from the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. Earlier today, he was transported to the border between North Korea and China, where he was met by our ambassador to the People's Republic of China, Nicholas Burns.
So he is now journeying to the United States. The State Department said they did not give anything in return for King's release. They also credit Sweden and China for helping broker the deal because the U.S. and North Korea do not have any direct relations. Before crossing, King was due in Texas for possible discipline over an assault charge in South Korea where he was on duty. U.S. officials say they will evaluate his condition, reunite him with his family before deciding on further action. This release is the result of weeks of negotiations and diplomacy. So let's bring in Chris Gilbert tonight, who's covering this from Tokyo. Chris, considering the need for middlemen here, and the state of U.S.-North Korea relations, how did the deal get done?
Yeah, well, it's been a huge diplomatic effort by many countries, and it does seem to have come about very quickly, doesn't it? I mean, at the moment, we have Travis King being expedited back to the U.S. just as quickly as he seemingly fled into the DPRK to begin with. And since then, North Korea, about a month ago, said that it was looking at an option to move him to some third country. That could have been Russia, that could have been China. It is the U.S., much to everyone's satisfaction, and that's taken the efforts of the UN, of Sweden, of China, of North Korea and the U.S. all doing heavy negotiations together over the past 2 months. However, the White House has said that this looks like a one-off kind of cooperation arrangement, not to expect too much into the future, and that tensions on the peninsula still remain at a simmer.
Yeah, I mean, one-off, you can say that again. You don't typically see Americans or anyone from a free country running, over to North Korea. But where does that leave things now, Chris? Or maybe change things at all between the U.S. and North Korea?
Well, first off, there have been a few incidents of Americans defecting to North Korea over the past few decades, but they haven't been very happy stories at the end of it, so it is quite a rare thing. But in terms of bilateral relations, this hasn't really worsened them because, to be honest, they can't get much worse. They are at rock bottom. There are no diplomatic ties between Washington and Pyongyang. There's no American embassy in Pyongyang, just like there's no ties between Japan and North Korea. But looking at the state of play at the moment, we're really seeing a shift from South Korea, which is affecting the situation. The leadership there of Yoon Suk-yeol for the last 18 months has adopted a very front-footed, militaristic approach towards North Korea. During his campaign to become president, he didn't even rule out a preemptive strike against North Korea. And so what we've seen under his leadership is a much more bristly, defensive response from Pyongyang. As we saw in last year, they fired a record number of ballistic missiles, and I don't think that the case of Travis King is going to do a lot to change that situation.
Look ahead now to the military's legal process and how that all works. Michel Paradis is a lecturer in law at Columbia University Law School, an expert in military law. Michel, how much trouble is this young soldier in?
Quite a lot. And once we know more facts about what he did while in North Korea, it could get much worse. I would say this most similar case to what we have, at least recently, is the case your audience may remember of Bergdahl, who went off post in Afghanistan a little over a decade ago, was captured by the Taliban, and ultimately held for a number of years before a negotiated release was executed by the Obama administration. It seems as if this release was done with much less diplomatic cost than the Bergdahl trade, which ultimately led the Obama administration to release a number of Taliban prisoners from Guantanamo that were quite controversial at the time. And that, in turn, I think, amped up the military's efforts to prosecute Bergdahl. This case, I think we might be looking at some mental health issues. Certainly what we have seen in the press so far about his behavior may suggest something that may certainly make this person not suitable for military service, but may not demand the book being thrown at them. But the range of possibilities is really quite severe for him.
How does it work in military law? Would a defection, would that become a separate case typically, or would that become I don't even know what to call it, an aggravating factor in the previous cases? How does that work?
Oh, it can be a separate case. There are a number of specific crimes, everything from going AWOL is the simplest, but also defecting, aiding the enemy, because we are technically still at war with North Korea. So this could be quite a serious case for him if the government chooses to proceed that way. At least some reporting has suggested that he may have been sort of speaking poorly about the United States in an effort to win favor of the North Koreans. There were cases like that in the 1950s, and they were dealt with quite severely. This is obviously not the 1950s, and so I think there are going to be a lot of fact-specific questions. Again, about his mental health, I think that's something we probably should, be a little, reserve some judgment on. But also the cost. It doesn't seem to cost the United States a lot to get him back. So that may reduce the government's desire to punish him, make an example of him. But the potential punishments and charges he could face in a court-martial could, even lead technically to the death penalty. I think that'd be highly unlikely, but certainly a lifetime in prison would be on the table.
I see. So it sounds like in the treason territory if we get there, but you said we have to think about, are there emotional disturbances? Are there mental issues of some sort? Who decides that? A psychiatrist, a judge?
A little of both. So I would expect this to be reviewed pretty closely by mental health personnel in the military who will make an assessment and even make a recommendation to his commanding officer about how and whether to prosecute him to the fullest extent of the law or do what it looks like they were planning to do anyway, which is hold something called an administrative separation board, which is a way of removing someone from the armed forces without technically punishing them for a crime, but getting them out on less than honorable circumstances. And that may be called for here. I don't think we know enough about him to make a really firm judgment about that. But if there are pretty severely aggravating circumstances, if it costs the government something that we haven't learned about yet to get him back, that may change people's attitudes, and he could be facing really quite severe penalties in what would be called a general court-martial, sort of the thing we're probably most familiar with looking on TV. Where someone gets brought before a criminal trial and could face essentially whatever the government wants to throw at them.
But Michelle, real quick, the reported facts were that he didn't get on the plane he was supposed to be on. He somehow orchestrated it to where he was going to be able to dash over the border, which is not an easy thing to do.
Yeah.
Would that tell you that he does have some wherewithal, that he's not completely, deranged, where he bears no responsibility?
Again, I'd be loath to speculate about his particular case, and it may not rise to the level of being incompetent or crazy and insane to stand trial. But if he was suffering from some sort of trauma, PTSD is not entirely uncommon, obviously in the Army, or some other sort of emotional or psychological problem that had either been poorly treated or undiagnosed, that just makes discretion the better part of valor. The military will certainly take that into account before throwing the book at him.
I see.
But if they want to, his exposure is quite high.
Well, military brass, would they see this as a weird one-off, do you think? Or is it PTSD is quite common, sadly, in the military, and not wanting to give anybody carte blanche to say, I'm sorry, I wasn't feeling myself, and
right. It's the easiest or simplest answer is it's a judgment call. They're gonna make a judgment about what kind of example they feel they need to set. Is this guy are the facts such that this guy is a one-off sort of issue? Very personal to him, that it's embarrassing to the government, it's annoying. He's certainly not someone we're going to keep in the Army. But if it's more aggravated than that, if he went to North Korea with a political motive, if he helped them make propaganda, which was certainly the case in many cases in the 1950s, they could technically seek the death penalty under a theory of aiding the enemy. I think that would be extremely unlikely under the circumstances, but it is the full range. He really faces the full range of potential liability, from everything from desertion, which is him running across the DMZ, all the way up to something really quite serious.
I mean, you just described the full spectrum from, maybe there was a mental disturbance to death penalty and discretion. That's the watchword, seems like. Michelle Parody, thanks for walking us through that.